Without witnesses. Albert Schweitzer, in My Childhood and Youth, recalls the moment when he felt ashamed of himself for the first time. He was around 3 years old and was playing in the garden. A bee came and stung his finger. Crying, the boy was comforted by his parents and some neighbors. Suddenly, young Albert realized that the pain had already passed several minutes ago, and he continued to cry just to get the attention of the audience. When recounting this story, Schweitzer was in his 70s. He had a fulfilled life behind him, a great life as an artist, a doctor, a philosopher, and a Christian soul dedicated to helping the poor and sick. But he still felt the shame of this first deception. This feeling had stayed with him over the years, deep in his memory, giving him tugs of conscience every time he was tempted to deceive himself. Note that no one around had noticed anything. Only young Schweitzer knew about his shame, only he had to answer for his actions before his conscience and his God. I am convinced that experiences of this kind, acts without witnesses, as I often call them, are the only possible foundation on which a person can develop an authentic, rigorous, and autonomous moral conscience. Only someone who, in solitude, can be strict and just with themselves, and against themselves, is capable of judging others fairly, instead of being swayed by the crowd's shouts, propaganda stereotypes, or self-interest disguised as noble moral pretexts. The reason for this is self-evident: a person has to be free from all external scrutiny to be sure they are looking at themselves and not at a social role, and only then can they make a completely sincere judgment. Only the person who is their own master is free, and no one is their own master if they can't even look into their own heart alone. Even the most candid conversation, the most spontaneous confession, does not replace this internal examination because they only matter when they are expressions of it, not passing outbursts induced by a casually stimulating atmosphere or vainglorious sincerity. Furthermore, it's not just the moral dimension of consciousness that develops in this confrontation, it's the entire consciousness, cognitive, aesthetic, practical. It is both approach and distance. It is the solitary judgment that creates a person's true intimacy with themselves, and it is also what creates the distance, the inner space in which lived experiences and acquired knowledge are assimilated, deepened, and personalized. Without this space, without this personal world conquered in solitude, a person is just a conduit through which information flows in and out, like food, transformed into waste. Not all human beings are naturally gifted with spontaneous perception and accurate judgment of their sins. Without these gifts, the desire for justice perverts into projecting blame onto others and rationalization, in the psychoanalytic sense of the term. Those who did not receive them at birth must acquire them through education. Moral education, therefore, consists less of memorizing lists of right and wrong than creating a moral environment conducive to self-examination, inner seriousness, and the responsibility of each person knowing what they did when no one was watching. For 2 millennia, such an environment was created and sustained by the Christian practice of the examination of conscience. There are equivalents in other religious and mystical traditions, but none in contemporary secular culture. There are psychoanalyses, psychotherapies, but they only function in this sense when they retain the religious reference to personal guilt and its redemption through confession before God. As society secularizes, or, mutatis mutandis, de-Islamizes, de-Judaizes, etc., this reference dissolves, and clinical techniques tend to produce the opposite effect, abolishing the sense of guilt, replacing it with selfish hardness confused with maturity, or with self-complacent, flimsy, and callous adaptability confused with sanity. The difference between religious technique and its modern counterparts is that it synthesized in the same dramatic experience the pain of guilt and the joy of complete liberation, something that secular ethics cannot do because it lacks the dimension of the final judgment. Civil confrontation cannot even dream destiny of that, by giving this experience a metaphysical
modern
significance,
culture has been doing
elevated
what it can
the yearning for personal responsibility
and
to the heights of every person's soul, the capacity for the supreme experience in which self-awareness is required to the maximum, and only in which, someone can acquire the authentic measure of the possibilities and duties of the human condition. Secular ethics, education for citizenship, is what remains on the surface when the inner conscience is silent, and when a person's actions no longer mean anything beyond infractions or obedience to a code of conventions and casual interests. Ethics, there is pure adaptation to the external, with no other inner resonance than what can be obtained through the forced internalization of slogans, clichés, and watchwords. Ethics, there is the sacrifice of conscience on the altar of the official lie of the day. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. This text was taken from the article, Without Witnesses, written by philosopher Olavo de Carvalho in 2000.